This is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Compromise and watered-down commitments on coal. Countries race to reach a deal at COP26 as the climate summit enters its final hours.
Our other headlines: condemnation for Belarus and a rising death toll on its border as thousands of migrants spend another night stranded in the freezing cold.
A fresh face or a familiar one? President Biden weighs his pick for chair of the Federal Reserve as soaring inflation turns up the heat on the White House.
M+ in terms of scale and the ambition surpass all local museums.
And art for art's sake, Hong Kong's long-awaited new Museum of Modern Art finally opens its doors. Pressure is mounting on nearly 200 governments to strike a deal to tackle climate change as the COP26 summit in Glasgow enters what should be its final hours. Despite 2 weeks of talks, the United Nations Secretary-General says efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are on life support.
A new draft deal has been released, which must be agreed by all countries. But with many still at odds over their climate commitments, negotiations could extend into the weekend. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Naweed Jabakel, who is in Glasgow. So, Naweed, we've had a new draft of the conclusions document. What's changed?
Hi, Robin. Yes, this new draft coming out early on Friday here, a second attempt that organisers hope will be able to get all of these countries, almost 200 of them, to agree on what happens next in terms of tackling climate change. Now, we've heard from Boris Johnson, the UK's Prime Minister, a very short while ago. He says that they've been, quote, moving heaven and earth to try and get all the parties to see the importance of this agreement. He also said that perhaps we won't clinch it all at COP26, but we should start. That's an important point because the whole discussion here is developing on a previous agreement made in Paris in 2015 to limit global temperature rises this century to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've also heard from the US's climate envoy, John Kerry, who said that more money was needed to help countries adapt to climate change and to mitigate future effects of climate change. That's something that the Chinese envoy, the head of the delegation here, has also reiterated, saying that more money needed to be directed towards the developing world. So the negotiations still going on. You could probably see above my shoulder journalists gathering again because they come out of one room and go into another room. What's happening at the moment is a lot of countries have been giving their feedback on this. That feedback will then be taken in. Perhaps there'll be more revisions, but at the moment it seems that there is a movement towards agreement, but we're not quite there yet.
Friday was the planned deadline for this COP26 summit as almost 200 countries look to agree on a way to protect the planet. In a bid to achieve that, an updated draft deal has softened the language around some of the key demands, especially on the use of coal and fossil fuels.
If it doesn't get across the line, it's only going to be because of a lack of political will, political determination and political leadership. And this generation of young people are watching. Let's not let them down.
Another important issue is who pays for climate change policies. Poorer countries want richer ones to offer them more help, as developed nations have historically contributed more to global emissions. The latest text calls for funding to be ramped up, but doesn't include an annual review of pledges. Many developing countries hope such a clause would put more pressure on donors.
12 years ago, rich countries made the pledge of $100 billion every year by 2020 for developing countries to tackle climate change. It still hasn't been met. This has greatly damaged political mutual trust. The success of COP26 will be hinged on whether the pledges can be met. Rich countries have yet to show their sincerity and commitment to honour their pledges.
Protesters, though, are demanding far more ambition and action. Around the city of Glasgow, a last-ditch effort to make their voices heard. For many climate activists, the international consensus being worked on here won't be enough to limit the impacts of global warming.
I don't think it's enough. I think we wanted more and we needed to see stronger action, but still has some bits that are important, like a call for countries to revise 2030 targets by next year. We think the text now is a floor. It's the absolute floor. We would like to see it improved, but still has some baby steps there.
This updated deal has made some vital concessions. It may be a matter of just a few words, but by giving countries more time to wean off fossil fuels, for example, or calling for a commitment to net zero by 2050, it's essentially hoping to ease any major concerns. In fact, this entire process has been a major balancing act, trying to incorporate different national needs, aspirations, political systems and economies, and getting them to agree on a common cause.
What comes out of Glasgow may be a feat of diplomacy at a time when the world seems fractured, but it may not be enough to meet that crucial 1.5-degree target.
And that's a really important point because of the COVID-19 pandemic. These sorts of meetings have been incredibly rare over the past couple of years. Geographically, the world has been very, very distant. So if anything does come out of here in the next few hours or the next few days, indeed, it's going to be significant. But don't forget, speaking to some of these delegates, what they've got to do with any agreement is then take it back to their countries and sell it to their own people, and also make sure that they're realistic. So no country wants to jump into this head first without making sure that it's going to be palatable for what happens back home. On the other hand, there's the climate activists saying that whatever comes out of this, the current deal that's in place isn't good enough. It's not going to stop all of those effects of climate change, like droughts, like wildfires, like heavy rains and extreme weather. So there's that concern as well. This could run on. The official time it's set to close is in the next couple of hours. If that goes on, there is precedent. Previous COP the last one that took place in 2019 in the Spanish capital went on for almost 2 days extra, which means that we might have to stay in Glasgow. At the moment, it's a wait-and-see approach. Back to you.
Nuid, good to talk to you. Nuid Jabarkil there in Glasgow.
Well, let's talk to Nigel Topping, who's the UK's high-level champion for climate action at COP26. The champion role was, by the way, created in 2015 at the climate talks in Paris to try to help realise ambitions to lower carbon emissions and build resilience to climate change. Nigel Topping, welcome. There are still very clearly sticking points in the draft conclusions document. What is yet to be agreed?
Well, I mean, as we've heard, it could just be down to a few words. I mean, the sticking points are always the degree of between, you know, encourages, urges, requests or requires, the sort of what the verb is, for example, on upping ambition. I mean, there's strong expectations, I think, from both civil society and business that countries who haven't yet delivered a second plan, as required by Paris, should do so as soon as possible. And also, given the dynamism of the changes that we're seeing in the real economy, that plans should generally be revised more often. International finance for adaptation is also a big issue, and the confidence that the 100 billion that was promised and hasn't yet been delivered will be delivered maybe as soon as next year. And then some of the language and the strength of the language around the phasing out of coal and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. Again, you can imagine that those are quite contentious issues between different countries, depending on how much they rely on income from those commodities. But one thing I would say is that what we haven't heard about is the fact that there's also been an awful lot of momentum from the organisations that I'm required to work with through my UN role, and that's non-state actors, cities, states and regions, businesses and investors. And we've seen more commitment and energy to short-term action from them than ever before. So I'm hoping that will encourage countries to be a bit bolder in these last 2 hours or 2 days, as we'll see.
For outside observers, it's very difficult to get a clear take on what's going on beyond the spin. The United Nations Secretary-General saying efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees are on life support, in his words. In your judgment, what has realistically been achieved over the last 2 weeks?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the trajectory before Paris, we were on track to more like a 6-degree temperature rise. After Paris, maybe just below 4 degrees. Coming into Glasgow, 2.7. That's continued to nudge down. The analysis suggests it's somewhere between 1.8 and 2.4 if everything that's been pledged is implemented. So still not 1.5. So I think the Secretary General is right to say that 1.5 degrees is on life support. But as I say, what's been achieved here? A lot more momentum in the real economy, a massive wave of commitments from the private finance sector to align their portfolios and balance sheets with 1.5 degrees. And real progress in the negotiating text in terms of the sense of dynamism required, and even including language on fossil fuel abatement or removal of coal from the power grid and removal of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It's quite a significant step forward, I think.
Our correspondent, Louis Jabarkal, not far from you, was suggesting a possibility of talks extending into the weekend. What are you hearing? Is there any point in extending? Is there still more to be agreed and talked about?
Well, until there's consensus, there's a point in extending, because if there's no consensus, then there's no agreement, and you don't want people to walk away from here without an agreement. The other thing which we didn't really talk about is some of the detailed technical negotiations on what we call the Paris Rule Book, rules about how often and how countries report their emissions reductions. Technical, but again really important, because if we don't agree on the mechanisms for transparency and keeping track, then how can we all trust each other? So that's also looking hopeful to be resolved. As to whether it's 2 hours or 2 days, I'd be very doubtful if it's 2 hours, because there's just a track record of running. It's almost like an unwritten rule of negotiations. You've got to go to the wire and then a little bit longer. If it is landed today, that'd be a real coup for the UK presidency, but more likely I think it'll be tomorrow.
And it's a very rarefied atmosphere inside that ring of steel among those world leaders. I wonder, as you cross in through security every morning to attend that conference, do you get the sense that those politicians are behind the people, in particular young people, when it comes to momentum on climate change?
Well, I think you'd have to say an overall assessment would be no, that the very loud and I mean, calls filled with pain, frustration, anger from young people and broader civil society are not being met by the level of ambition we see in the negotiations. Of course, they're not the only people that politicians have to work with. They're trying to balance all the voices back home. But I think that those loud voices are upping the pressure, and we are seeing more ambition as a result of that. It's just, getting 196 countries to agree on every comma is a very high bar for consensus. So my sense is we'll see another ratchet in ambition. We won't be on track to 1.5, but hopefully we'll see the dynamism in the real economy being reflected now in a more frequent requirement to update plans, so that we do get on track to 1.5 within the next 2 or 3 years.
Nigel Topping at COP26 in Glasgow, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Zhao Yingmin is China's Vice Minister for the Environment and head of the Chinese delegation at COP26. He told CGTN about China's position on the targets set in the Paris Climate Accord and his expectations for the end of the conference.
A key issue in the negotiations is whether to stick to the Paris goals of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees with 1.5 degrees within reach, or just 1.5 degrees. It's a question of whether we stick to the Paris Agreement and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We must see that addressing climate change has become an urgent challenge. At the same time, it must be based on science and rules. This rule is the Paris Agreement. At the last day of the conference, I hope that all parties can meet each other halfway. Developed countries should honour their commitments and put their best efforts into helping developing countries, so as to build mutual trust and reach agreements on the key issues of the conference.
Eurozone industrial production dropped in September for the second consecutive month as a global supply chain shortage continues to hit manufacturing. Eurostat says output from factories and utilities across 19 countries fell 0.2% in September compared with August. Industrial production rose 5.2% in September compared with the previous year, but stayed below pre-pandemic levels. Japan's Toshiba Corp has outlined plans to break up into 3 independent companies to meet shareholder demands after a series of damaging scandals. Its energy and infrastructure division will form one business, and its device and storage section will make up a second. A third company will oversee Toshiba's share of flash memory chip company and other assets. AstraZeneca is to move away from dispensing its COVID vaccine on a not-for-profit basis. The drugs giant has delivered 1.5 billion doses at cost price. The British-Swiss multinational previously said it would only charge for the vaccine when COVID was no longer a pandemic. Announcing third-quarter results, the group said it would return to a modest profitability model in developed countries.
A teenage boy has reportedly died after being exposed to freezing temperatures on the border between Belarus and Poland. It comes amid an escalating migrant crisis, with thousands of people stranded along the Belarusian crossing, hoping to enter the EU. Western countries have accused President Alexander Lukashenko of orchestrating the standoff for political purposes. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Linda Kennedy, who is in Budapest. So, Linda, what's the latest from the Poland-Belarus border?
Well, the latest is bleak conditions and bleak news. Police in the Polish town of Białystok confirmed that a 14-year-old boy had died on the border due to freezing conditions there. That brings to 9 the number of people it's thought have died so far, although Polish volunteer organisations and charities say they think the number is a lot higher. There were images emerging today of migrants who were physically fighting for food that had been brought to them by Belarusian soldiers. And these are all people who are trapped. I mean, they're trapped between the razor wire fence of the EU frontier and the armed Belarusian army. And all those soldiers who will stop them going back to Minsk. They are the victims of what the EU has called a dangerous trap, enticed there to then be shipped down to the threshold of the EU, where the EU's humanitarian policies and values are basically being challenged by Belarus. In terms of figures for illegal attempts to cross the border, well, the Polish border guards say there has been 223 in the last 24-hour period. And they say that one of those was a group of 35, including women and children, who, according to local police, were pushed across the border by Belarusian soldiers. There was another big attempt, say the Polish border guard, of 100 people, and that was much further south on the border from Kuznica, which is the area where a lot of the activity has been taking place. But there's still no humanitarian help and access to this border because of the state of emergency that Poland has imposed. Today there was a plea from non-governmental organisations in Poland to give them access. One volunteer saying that he had to make the decision to leave a 5-year-old with their mother in the forest overnight because that was the least bad option available.
And meanwhile, Linda, the war of words between Western countries and Russia continues. What more can you tell us?
A war of words, yes, and a lot of grandstanding too. There were paratroopers from Belarus and Russia who were doing drills near the border today, and that comes after yesterday when there were nuclear-capable bombers, Russian ones, that were overflying Belarus as a show of support for their ally. And yesterday too brought that threat from Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, that he was going to cut off natural gas supplies to Europe. Russians stepping back from that today, saying they hadn't been consulted before he said that, and they would fulfill their gas delivery contracts. The Vice President of the US, Kamala Harris, has just said this afternoon that the US is very concerned about this troubling activity, and that comes 24 hours after some barbs at the UN, where the Western members of the Security Council condemned what they call the cynical instrumentalization of migrants by Belarus. But Russia's deputy envoy to the UN was saying that it was a bit silly of the EU to be bringing that up there. It showed masochistic inclinations, because that ties into the theory that Belarus and Russia is trying to dare the EU to abandon its humanitarian values.
OK, Linda Kennedy in Budapest, thanks very much. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the world's largest market wants to get larger. The message from China for leaders at the APEC meeting.
This week on a Razor Malaria special, how China became free of the disease and a new technique to genetically engineer malaria-carrying mosquitoes.
You have a lot of people, they know malaria only on papers, but behind this every single number, you have a lot of emotional suffering, and if there is really good solution that can help us to end this suffering, they have to help us to achieve it.
climate change is happening right now. World leaders are holding vital talks that will change the course of humanity. Action could save millions of lives. Failure could cost many more. Do they have the will to act quickly? Does the climate have the time to wait? Follow full coverage from the COP26 climate talks here on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
President Xi Jinping has promised to further open up China's vast markets to the outside world in an address to APEC leaders. The 28th Summit of Pacific Rim Economies is taking place virtually, hosted by New Zealand. Well, Hosogali Makiyama is director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, and he joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much indeed for being with us today. So, talk of further opening up from China's president, as well as of cooperation. What did you make of his remarks?
Well, Xi's speech was definitely interesting, and in many regards, I found it extremely reconciliatory, especially because China could have taken a much more defensive stance if you think about what kind of countries there are actually in APEC. You have, first of all, you have the current conflicts that no one has missed with Australia and United States, but also we need to bear in mind that in APEC, it's one of the very few international forums where Beijing and Taipei actually sit around at the same table. So it was quite impressive from that point of view that President Xi affirmed and supported common goals, including a very ambitious plan that New Zealand has launched and actually turned into an action plan around closer cooperation called the Putrajaya Vision, and also reaffirming many of the other points. And it also contained quite a few interesting nuggets that are linked to their host, Jacinda Ardern.
And usually APEC meetings focus on trade, but this year's, perhaps not surprisingly, have been dominated by climate change.
Well, I do dare to actually challenge you on that, because if you look at the deliverables, especially during the New Zealand chairmanship, you can see commitments to eliminate duties, for example, on medical goods to fight the pandemic. You have also, exactly as you're saying, a commitment to climate change. But if you really look into the details, there are quite interesting work that has been promoted by New Zealand, for example, on standardization or agreement on what kind of services could actually constitute environmental services that should be promoted by all the APEC countries. So yes, indeed, there are certain objectives, but the instrument or the tool of the trade, if I may say, is trade and economics.
And obviously the pandemic couldn't be ignored, could it? Are the regions at something of a crossroads after that? What are the major challenges it faces to bounce back?
Well, the economy is, of course, economy is one of the big questions, because certain countries, for example, like China, is almost or entirely out of the dark tunnel, and some people are still inside it. And here's where I think we have to really look at the fact that the APEC is not a trade agreement. It doesn't actually liberalize trade, but what it does is that it makes sure that there is a ratchet to make sure that things don't get worse. We have to remember that APEC members are sovereigns, which means that they are free to undertake any domestic regulations or trade policy that they like, but actually agreeing and sit around the table and say, we will stop from making things work for each other. And that's where APEC is a really interesting forum as a forum for international cooperation, where all recognize that they hang together.
Well, I wanted to get a bit more detail on that, actually. How valuable is it to have a forum like this with some big world players outside of something like the G20, where regional issues can take centre stage?
It's interesting you would say that, because G20 and APEC may operate kind of in a similar way, because it tends to be incubator for ideas, and also where things can be tested and before they're taken, for example, to a World Trade Organization or sometimes in the sidelines of APEC and G20, many of the issues are pre-negotiated, which we also see a couple of weeks ago at the G20 meeting. But one thing that actually differentiates APEC from G20, which is that all the members of G20 are neighbors. They depend on each other. Although I'm sure that the relationship between two G20 countries, like let's say Argentina and Turkey, is really, really impressive and intense. But you can really look at the APEC as a club of neighbors. And you don't have a Europe in the room. You don't have necessarily certain players who are Atlantic facing, or you don't have Africa. So which basically means that when they actually gather around APEC, they need to get along. And that's what's really impressive about this cooperation, where China has now been a member for 30 years. And President Xi was also very, he recognized the fact that APEC had been really important for China's development in this regard.
Hosukli Makiyama from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today.
The achievements of the last 100 years and the future direction of China have both been under discussion at the 6th plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. CGTN Sun Ye reports.
A historic plenum and a historic resolution explained.
The party has achieved many encouraging accomplishments and triumphed over many challenges. Now the party, the army, and the people have become stronger and more united than ever. Our experience has proved that it is the wishes of Chinese people of all ethnicities that position Xi Jinping at the core of the CPC. And Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as a guiding thought.
The plenum had affirmed to uphold General Secretary Xi Jinping's core position on the party Central Committee and in the party as a whole, and uphold the Central Committee's authority and its centralized, unified leadership. The resolution aims to lay out what made China's transformation possible and sustainable for the future. Among the most compelling declarations, core leadership is important.
For a country or political party, the core of leadership is crucial. Former CPC leader Deng Xiaoping once pointed out that a leadership without a core cannot be relied on. The party has more than 95 million members. China has 56 ethnic groups and a population of 1.4 billion. It is inconceivable that the CPC Central Committee and the entire party do not have a core. Only when the Central Committee and the whole party have a core can the party gain strength.
Head of the Institute of Party History and Literature of the CPC Central Committee, Qu Qingshan, also said the party's two previous resolutions on historical issues had unified the thoughts of party members at critical historical moments and created a guarantee of the success of the party. He said he expected this new resolution will do the same and perhaps will be of even greater significance with the 20th National Congress coming next year. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, seeing the woods for the trees. How Germany is breathing new life into its forests.
It's the first day in Germany that vaccination centers like this one are offering a third jab.
There are fears there could be a fifth wave of COVID-19 cases.
Market watchers have a keen eye on infection rates,
safety and efficacy of COVID-19 shots.
France closed schools in the first lockdown in spring last year.
France has been a leader in vaccinating youngsters.
If a spike necessitates another lockdown,
Italy is now close to reaching its target of immunising 80% of the population over the age of 12.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top story: compromise and watered-down commitments on coal. Countries race to reach a deal at COP26 as the climate summit enters its final schedule today.
And let's stay with that story because the president of COP26, Britain's Alok Sharma, has called on countries to inject a can-do spirit to get a final agreement over the line on what is meant to be the final hours of the United Nations Climate Summit. Let's take you to Glasgow and talk to Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. Isabel, you're there. What is the sentiment, do you sense? How close are negotiations to reaching any kind of conclusion?
There's still work to do, I have to say, but it's very intense. I mean, behind me there are people coming and going through the area where in those rooms, the delegates are getting down to really hard bargaining. We had a long session with Alok Sharma and countries expressing their views on the latest draft, which dropped this morning. And, you know, there is definitely some progress. There are, again, we're getting down to the moment when each country tries to defend its particular interests. So, you know, not everyone accepts everything. But I think that there is a sense that it won't finish tonight, but that we will leave here with something. And there were some very emotional speeches. Frans Timmermans, for example, of the European Commission, held up a picture of his infant grandson and said, when this child is 28, we will be at mid-century, and the decisions that we take here now will determine, you know, whether we're fighting each other for food and water when he's 28. So it was powerful personal stuff, and I think that there is definitely a feeling that they're not going to solve it here in Glasgow, but we have to move along and keep the process going.
Can you give us a steer on what sticking points remain?
They're fairly, they're almost the usual suspects. So there is still disappointment about the finance package, but again, on loss and damage, there is a discussion about setting up a new mechanism that would organise compensation for loss and damage. The details of that are still being argued over. There is a very strong feeling that, given that we're not going to leave Glasgow with nationally determined contributions aligned to 1.5. We have to accelerate the programme of coming back and offering fresh and stronger promises. And the proposal is that before Cairo, before the next COP, there should be another round of enhanced ambition, new NDCs. Now, I think China's a little nervous about that because China's planning process has its own rhythm. On the other hand, it's quite clear that if we don't align with 1.5, you know, we're just not going to make it. So if it is an existential threat, we have to treat it like an existential threat, which is what John Kerry and indeed Xi Jinping have been arguing over. So these mechanisms are important. Some of them seem a little obscure to people. For example, there's this thing called Article 6, which is setting the rules for carbon trading, and there's a lot of anxiety about those rules being really robust. Otherwise, they're not really doing any good, and a bad system would allow countries to cheat, it would allow double counting, it would allow, it would bring the mechanism of accounting for carbon into disrepute. So these technical details get very important at this point.
The mood music 2 weeks ago when this started was very gloomy indeed. I wonder to what extent did this week's US-China announcement shift the mood?
I think it was a real shot in the arm, honestly. It was a surprise, but it was a good surprise. And I mean, the difficulty is that when the US and China, when the biggest emitters are fighting each other, it just takes all the energy out of the process, because that's what people talk about, that's what they look at. And it makes it much harder to do everything else. So when you establish a positive cooperation, it has the opposite effect. You can see, a way forward again, and one that's not being distracted by big hostility between the two over climate. So it was very positive, and I think everyone is very tired here. You can see they're negotiating very late into the night. You get documents released with timestamps of 2 in the morning, and everyone's kind of living on coffee. But nevertheless, the energy that agreement, that Wednesday night announcement gave to the process was very positive.
Just looking forward to the Presidents Xi and Biden meeting next week, I wonder what your expectations are of that.
Well, I think one of the important things that came out of the US-China agreement here on climate, it was the promise to set up a working group. And that work is going to have to be very, very coherent and very consistent, because that is what the cooperation is going to be judged on. And there are ideas circulating in advance of the Xi Jinping-Joe Biden summit that working groups on other issues could be set up, and that we could see a beginning of a rebuilding of the kind of exchanges, not just government to government, but science and education and, civil society and business, all those exchanges which help to keep relations on some kind of track, and to avoid accidents, to avoid unpleasant things happening without anyone quite intending. That if that summit were to go well, and I hope that the climate agreement would help, again, the mood music there, that we might see a rebuilding of exchanges and more working groups and more collaboration. I don't know what's going to come out, but I would very much hope that might.
Isabel Hilton, the founder of China Dialogue at Glasgow at COP26, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bank of China has issued billions of dollars of green sovereign bonds on the London Stock Exchange for the first time. Green bonds raise money to invest in climate and environmental projects, in contrast to ordinary bonds, where there's no specified use for the funds. CGTN's Guy Henderson reports.
China has the second largest bond market in the world, and it's now going to be easier for international investors to access it, because Bank of China has now issued more than $2 billion worth of green bonds here at the London Stock Exchange. Now, many have been left pretty jittery about exposure to China in recent months after a crackdown on big tech there, as well as continued concerns about the ability of its largest property developer, Evergrande, to pay back its debts on time. But these bonds will be a longer-term bet on the prospects of a Chinese economy that is on a path towards becoming the world's largest. These bonds aren't due to mature until the years 2023 and 2024, and bank officials expect there to be a lot of interest.
We know that the amount of demand worldwide, globally, outstrips the amount of supply. Part of the problem is that many of the companies that need to be offering debt to the markets are not yet in a position to acceptably issue green and sustainable bonds on a basis which everyone will see as transparent and fair. One of the things we can do as a bank is step in the middle.
Regulation of green finance is still evolving, but the bank says that every dollar of the debt raised will be linked to projects in the real green economy. Guy Henderson, CGTN at the London Stock Exchange.
Well, while the world's attention has been on the COP26 summit in Glasgow, scientists all around the world continue to work on climate solutions.
In Germany, a government study has found that more than two-thirds of the country's woodlands are unhealthy. But one professor is on a mission to save Germany's forests. Natalie Carney reports.
Somit Saha was lured into forestry by tigers in his native India. He knew he had to save their habitat in order to save them. So he moved to Germany for his studies back in 2008. And since, Saha has been working with the country's nearly 90 billion trees, trying to heal the 80% that are sick due to deforestation and climate change impacts, such as drought.
So this is a leaf of Fagus sylvatica. Actually, trees are adapted to drought because in their long life they had to encounter many events of drought. But the frequency of drought and the intensity of the drought are increasing, and when the trees get weakened, they are automatically then vulnerable to other kind of pests like bark beetle, which worsen their health condition.
Saha suggests diversifying our forests away from monoculture clusters common in German forests.
The monoculture are very much vulnerable to climate change impact because monoculture means only one species. So if that species get impacted by drought or weakened by disease, and then you have high vulnerability to lose the whole green cover.
Also helping is the careful introduction of foreign trees, species that are used to environmental stresses. According to Saha, there are 77 tree species in Germany, and around 10 to 12 of those are non-native. But care must be given that these non-native trees don't harm the local environment.
It's not only about just keeping the trees alive, it's also about ensuring high habitat diversity in order to enhance biodiversity.
So you can see here that this is very old tree, and you have a lot of crevices which work as a habitat for many small insects and fungi. And also you see that the woodpeckers were trying to get inside. And if you look at the top, you will see that there are a lot of holes which act as a bird nest. So they provide such a high habitat for biodiversity.
Dr. Michael Schmidt imports tree seeds from warmer countries like Greece, Turkey, and Lebanon to see how they cope in German forests.
We have to manage a rapid migration to forests that can cope with a climate that's warming by 2, 3, or 4 degrees and also lower rainfall. That's why we take a very close look at the Mediterranean region, where the climate's what we might expect to have in about 80 years.
Yet Professor Saha suggests we study the non-native trees already in the country.
We don't know which will be the new disease or new pathogens which impact non-native tree species, But the non-native tree species who are here for last 200 years, we already know their track record.
In addition to the environmental benefits, forestry and forest-related industries turn over $196 billion annually in Germany. Another strong reason for keeping our forests alive. Natalie Carney, CGTN, Karlsruhe, Germany.
This week at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, the UK's National Weather Service revealed that 1 billion people will be affected by extreme heat if the global temperature rises by just 2 degrees Celsius. And if it hits 4 degrees, half the world's population will suffer.
CGTN's Stephen Cole has been talking to Europe's first chief heat officer in Greece, who's tasked with beating the heat in Athens. She's been telling him why air conditioning units are counterproductive.
It's a vicious circle what air conditionings do, because they blow hot air out into the public sector while they cool the indoors. So it's a very double-edged sword. And we know that in about the 1.6 billion air-conditioned units that are working today around the world are burning the same amount of energy as the whole continent of Africa for all of its energy uses. So it's not a solution. The solution is that we start building our buildings differently. We have been talking a lot about energy upgrades, but we have to start really doing heat upgrading our buildings, like making them much more resilient to heat.
And you can see much more of that interview on the agenda with Stephen Cole this weekend here on CGTN.
The number of migrants crossing the English Channel, the sea between France and the UK, has hit a new daily record. Around 1,000 people were picked up by border security forces on Thursday, with fears that 3 may have drowned attempting to cross in kayaks. The UK government has described the situation as unacceptable and claimed French authorities have lost control of their borders.
Austria is days away from placing millions of unvaccinated people into lockdown as COVID infections soar to record highs. The worst affected province of Upper Austria is expected to introduce restrictions from Monday, including a ban on restaurants, hotels and hairdressers for people who have not received both jabs. Austria has one of the lowest coronavirus vaccination rates in Europe.
The German health minister has said his country must do everything necessary to break a 4th wave of coronavirus. It comes as the country experiences record high numbers of infections. From this weekend, Germany will reintroduce free COVID-19 tests, and from next week, doctors will get more money for carrying out vaccinations.
Children in the Czech Republic will have to get tested for COVID as part of efforts to try to reduce a surge in cases. The Czech government says daily infection rates have gone over 10,000 3 times this week. Almost 2/3 of the population have been fully vaccinated against COVID, which is below the EU average.
French President Emmanuel Macron has met his Italian counterpart Mario Draghi ahead of a security summit on Libya. Macron's hosting a number of international leaders for the Paris summit, being held ahead of Libya's planned presidential election in December. US Vice President Kamala Harris and acting German Chancellor Angela Merkel are also expected to attend.
Investors are waiting with bated breath to see whether US President Joe Biden will keep Jerome Powell as chair of the Federal Reserve for a second term or appoint Federal Governor Lael Brainerd to the post instead. The decision is seen as crucial as the White House tries to tackle soaring inflation. Let's talk to CGTN's correspondent John Terrett in New York. John, talk us through the candidates then.
Well, I'm glad you used the word crucial, because I think a lot of people here feel that it is crucial, and it really is about time that Biden revealed who his pick is, because he must know by now. Now, the Federal Reserve is responsible for monetary policy, bank stability, and as much full employment as they can possibly muster. And so appointing a chairman to that organization is absolutely key to confidence in this country, really, if nothing else. Confidence, I think, is the key word. And Biden is under pressure because, as I say, we think he knows who he wants. Inflation is getting a real grip here now. People are noticing. They're getting very worried about it. The president is talking openly about it now. And also his spending bill, the second of the 2 spending bills, has not yet been signed into law. It hasn't even been voted through yet in the House or the Senate, and they may have to rewrite it because of the inflation. So the most well-known of all the chairmen of the Federal Reserve was Alan Greenspan, and Janet Yellen, who's now the Treasury Secretary, was the first woman to hold the post. And the reason I keep saying that Biden must know is because he's already interviewed the 2 leading candidates. And here they are, a little bit about each of them. Jerome Powell, you know, 68 years old. He's the present chairman of the FOMC. He was appointed by President Trump, which kind of counts against you when you have a Democratic president in the White House. Also, on top of that, though, he has averted a COVID economic crisis. There's been a much more rapid recovery than people thought. But against him, the supply chain bottlenecks are causing inflation, as you know. There are millions of people still out of work. And only today we learned that there are 10.438 million open jobs in this country. That's fresh data out today, Friday. And there were 2 trading scandals, which I won't bother you with, among his team while he's been in the job. On the other hand, Lael Brainerd has been on the FOMC committee now since 2014, so that's 7 years. She's being pushed hard by the progressives in the Democratic Party, but that makes her confirmation very unlikely among Republicans who will, when the confirmation process comes through. So at the moment, it's 68-31 in favor of Powell over Brainerd. But Biden will get a chance to reshape the tone of the committee because there are at least 2 other posts that need to be filled. So if he sticks with Powell, a Trump appointee originally, then he still gets to shape, as I say, the overall committee. But people here want him to get on with it and say, who he's chosen so that planning can be done, basically.
John, it's a day of splitting up. We were reporting earlier in the show on Toshiba of Japan splitting into three,
Yes.
and news out there that Johnson & Johnson
Yes.
is splitting into two.
Yeah, I didn't know about Toshiba. I haven't seen that story yet because it's still relatively early in the morning here. I mean, we are talking about the death of the conglomerate, folks. We really are. I mean, for years the idea was to bring all sorts of strands of manufacturing together under one title, and that is ending. Toshiba, you tell me. Earlier this week we had GE do the same thing. General Electric, founding member of the Dow Jones, global behemoth, biggest company in America, now splitting into three. It'll be aviation, energy and healthcare. And those are three separate public companies, with the name GE being attached to the aviation division, which will work mainly for Boeing. And now today, everyone here is talking about Johnson & Johnson, the provider of the single-dose vaccine, and it is splitting into two. So they're going to have a consumer company that will do things like Band-Aids and headache pills, that sort of stuff, and then a prescription drugs and medical devices division. And that's interesting because that brings in Janssen, which is the Belgian-based partner that they have, which employs 5,000 people in Belgium. So we'll see what happens to that partnership. CEO Alex Gorski says this is nothing to do with the lawsuits. There are lawsuits out there against Johnson & Johnson regarding the opioid crisis that we've had for 15 years in America and the link between talcum powder and the issue of ovarian cancer. But Johnson & Johnson shares are up 1.3% now. They were up 5%. So Wall Street likes the idea. And here's a tip for you. Everybody here is looking now at 3M, which is a Minnesota-based company. They make Scotch tape and Post-it notes, and they also make chemicals and auto parts and fiber optics. So 3M could be next. Their shares are up 2% now. Jamie and Robin.
John, everyone in the gallery is writing down your tips. Thank you very much. John Terrett there for us in New York.
Don't blame me if it's wrong.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Tate Modern and the Pompidou Centre are getting some competition as a new museum of modern art opens its doors in Hong Kong.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Move over MoMA and the Metropolitan. There is a new kid on the block when it comes to the world's top museums. A highly anticipated modern art museum has opened its doors to the public in Hong Kong.
It's a huge building with a wide range of contemporary works and is expected to play a major part in the growth of the region's art scene. Anne Chang reports.
Hong Kong's long-awaited M+ Museum has finally opened and is offering free admission for the first year. Touted as Asia's first global museum of contemporary visual culture, it's designed by renowned architecture firm Herzog & de Meuron in partnership with locally based TFP Pharos and Arab.
In total, 1,500 works are presented within 17,000 square meters of exhibition space that spans across 33 galleries and other display spaces. Right now, I'm entering the main hall gallery, which features Hong Kong Here and Beyond. It's one of 6 thematic exhibitions which focuses on the city's visual cultures from the 1960s till now.
Divided into 4 chapters of here, identities, places, and beyond, this exhibit presents Hong Kong through multiple and intersecting perspectives that mirror the city's dynamism.
If you think this is an apartment, that's right. Called Domestic Transformer by architect Gary Chang, this is a reproduction of his 32-square-meter home. Movable walls and multifunctional furniture make this space easily transformable into anything, from a bedroom to a kitchen. It's Chang's solution to compact living in a hyperdense urban environment.
In the East Gallery, Things, Spaces, Interactions displays over 500 examples of design and architecture that have had a profound influence in Asia over the last 70 years. Meanwhile, at the West Gallery, Anthony Gormley's Asian Field is an expansive installation of over 80,000 clay figurines selected from the original 200,000. Created by the British sculptor with around 300 villagers from Guangdong, it reflects China's vast territory and population. Aside from the artworks, which all have an Asian element, the building's architecture is also a highlight.
This spiral staircase in the middle of this atrium leads to a rooftop garden above. There are 2 voids on each side, in front and behind me, that connect through the whole building, so people can see the space through 3 different levels.
At the basement, the found space is a cavernous exhibition area that's excavated along the contours of the railway tunnels running beneath it. Outside, the building's exterior, inspired by Chinese roofs, is covered in green terracotta tiles forming a modular facade system. M+ covers 65,000 square meters in the West Kowloon Cultural District, a large arts development project in the city.
M+, in terms of scale and the ambition, surpass all local museums. We have 17,000 square meters of gallery space, and which is equivalent or on par with like Centre Pompidou and Tate Modern. And indeed, these museums have very close relationship with M+. They are already talking about collaboration in future.
Feng says she's excited about the national 14th five-year plan for Hong Kong to be the center for cultural exchange between China and the rest of the world. She adds that the West Kowloon Cultural District will play an important role in advancing that mission. Anne Chang, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them.
All that and more at CGTN.com. The headlines again. Compromise and watered-down commitments on coal. Countries race to reach a deal at COP26 as the climate summit enters its final hours. But we're hearing suggestions that those talks might extend into the weekend.
Condemnation for Belarus and a rising death toll on its border as thousands of migrants spend another night stranded in the freezing cold.
And President Biden weighs his pick for chair of the Federal Reserve as soaring inflation turns up the heat on the White House.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.